Hi, I'm Chris,
And I'm Eli.
and we are the Landlord Gurus. We've been managing our own rental property for decades now, and we've created this show to share our experiences, tips, and best practices we've refined over the years. Thanks for joining us, whether you found us on YouTube or our podcast or at landlordgurus.com. Before we get started, just a reminder to like, share, and subscribe so you'll get notified when we put out new content. All right. Hi there, everybody. We're Landlord Gurus back again with another edition of our podcast where Eli and I talk about various issues that might be relevant to landlords like ourselves and like you. Today, we're joined by a special guest, Grant Burwash from FrontLobby. We'll introduce him in a bit, let him kind of introduce him and his company. Today's topic, we're going to talk about what happens when, the process of moving out a tenant. If you listen to us, we've talked a lot about the move-in process. We've talked a lot about the operations of when you have a tenant in your rental, as far as collecting rent, things like that, maintenance. But yeah, what happens when you have a tenant that moves out? And we've talked about refunding security deposits, the move-out inspection, getting keys back, all that kind of stuff. But what we haven't really mentioned, and I guess because we've been fortunate enough that it hasn't been a major issue for us, but it's like what happens when a tenant moves out and they've got unpaid debt, whether it's rent or it's damages that maybe they've accrued that, the security deposit doesn't cover, or, basically anything else, late fees that they haven't paid. It can be anything. So we haven't really talked about that. This is where Grant and this is where FrontLobby come into play. And so yeah, Grant, welcome.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Great. So yeah, maybe you can just kind of introduce yourself and introduce FrontLobby a bit, kind of at a high level, and let everyone know what.
Yeah, for sure. I've, a bit about myself. I've been a real estate investor. I've been a landlord. I've been a tenant, and kind of all this experience culminated with FrontLobby, which I joined almost 5.5 years ago, I guess, as we were the first company that allowed rental data to be reported to the credit bureaus in Canada, and then quickly followed into the US. And a vast majority of our users have one or two units. We have some mid-sized property management companies and mid-sized landlords as well. But really what we offer is the ability to port rental data, both on-time payments and debts from current and former tenants, to the credit bureaus. Really helps in delinquency prevention, rewarding on-time payments. And then we do also offer some screening services as well. So for the purposes of today, we'll talk a lot about the rent reporting structure and how even if you have one unit, you can kind of get those same sort of protections that historically have been only available to mortgage companies or auto loans in the past.
Okay. And that's rent reporting there. We're talking about the process of reporting either on time or late or unpaid rent in the process of a tenancy. Is that mostly what you're referring to when you reference rent reporting?
Yeah. We're a bit unique because a lot of our business comes from debts. So meaning housing providers come to us, they want to manage any sort of delinquencies and on-time payments for those current tenants. So that's the rent reporting that you referred to.
Okay.
We also offer a product that if a tenant moves out with a debt or has a debt from the past 7 years within the US, you can report that to the credit bureaus as well. And so, that's a way that, there's a bunch of stuff I'm sure that we'll talk through today as far as using the court system, using eviction specialists, your security deposit or last month's rent, whatever that is. But if you find yourself in a position where a debt's owed, you can use our platform to add a leverage by having that debt show up on the individual's credit file. So just make sure you're top of line to get paid even after they get out of your property.
So is this something sort of like you talk through with your tenants up front, like, hey, I'm going to be reporting your rent payments, whether you make them or whether you don't make them. And this is beneficial to the tenant because, obviously the successful rent payments show up on their credit report as,
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
It does. Yeah. So, best practice is you implement this while your tenants are in your units. And the reason why I say this is starting to see more of a push towards having on-time payments included in credit files. You saw California that passed a law called AB 2747 that mandated if you operate a building with over 15 units, you must offer this to the tenants. And all of us having purchased properties understand the value of credit. It helps get you into that financial system. If you're new to country or new to credit, reporting your rental data is a really quick way to escalate that credit score so you can create some of that financial well-being, financial inclusion. So on the positive side, it's a massive impact. So in tight markets, you can use that as a way to make your units more attractive to potential tenants. When you're rolling this out, I know we're not talking about screening today, but when someone's looking in at your units, even simply having the conversation say, hey, Eli, I report rental data to the credit bureaus. If you want to have your on-time payments, you can provide consent to do that. But if there's ever a debt, that's going to get reported to the credit bureaus. And the important distinction, which is different than what most people think, is that consent is never going to be required when you're reporting a debt to the credit bureaus. So whether it's a current tenant or former tenant that owes you a debt, you don't need consent from them to do that. We do require consent for that positive side. And so when you're looking at screening on an individual or rolling this out with your current tenants, they can opt into the benefits, but you as a housing provider get protection by reporting that debt, regardless of whether the tenant provides consent or agrees to that or not.
There's some aspect of that that seems counterintuitive to me. So maybe you can help me understand. It would seem like there would only be an upside to the tenant to have an on-time payment registered with the credit bureaus, right? And maybe I'm not imagining a downside. Maybe there is one. So I'm a bit confused on why they would need to give consent to that, but wouldn't have to give consent for negative reporting, which could potentially have a downside for them. And also having looked at, lots of kind of services in this arena, a lot of people who are looking at this topic, it seems to me, are not reporting the late or missed payments, whereas you guys do. So I guess that's probably two questions, how does this consent thing work? And then I think you guys are fairly unique in how you approach this. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with all that. So for the positive side, you're correct. There's really no downside to having your rent reported. Some people that have really good credit scores, they don't do it just because they feel like I've already got 750 or 800. It's going to have a minimal impact at that point in time, so they can choose not to. But it's really kind of operated from the CFPB. We're trying to say, you know what, this is going to be a benefit. If you don't want to participate, that's fine. Okay. No one's going to force you. And so really, and further, it's like there is no downside, but you can do that. However, when you're looking at the debts, it's been long established around the ability for a creditor to report data to the credit bureaus to ensure they help get paid, right? So the purpose of reporting that debt is to help protect the creditor who's extended credit. In this case, that's housing to an individual. And so where the rental side becomes a bit unique, we're all used to when you take out a credit card, you sign to say this data is going to go to the credit bureaus. When you get a mortgage, you sign and say this data is going to go to the credit bureaus. That infrastructure doesn't exist in the rental space today. Okay. And so you see companies like us that have come forward and said, we don't just want the positive information. We really want to have all the information on the credit files. So when you're looking at Chris as a potential tenant, you can say, I see Chris has missed some rent payments in the past. Now we can make a more informed decision as opposed to only seeing small snippets as far as only the positive payments and completely missing out on the debt. We really want to help those great tenants that are paying on time show, and any future creditor, whether that's a landlord, auto loan, mortgage, whatever, to say, this is proof that I paid a large amount of money every single month for my rent, and it helps me get included in whatever sort of credit. Conversely, we want to warn any sort of future housing providers to say that, Grant has this sort of risk profile, and you can see that he still owes unpaid rent to, Chris and Eli and those sorts of things. So we have structured our company in a way that we want to be able to report debts for any sort of housing provider, because we want to provide them with that protection, because we as housing providers want that information and protection.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I see this as a really good benefit for landlords like myself. I operate some properties where a lot of my tenants are relatively young and just out of school or just out of grad school. And, a lot of them don't really have much credit to speak of. And I think particularly nowadays, I see a lot of applicants that don't even have a credit card. And so with very little credit, it seems like this is something that I can offer these tenants and say, hey, let's report your rent. I'm going to report your debt anyways, so let's report your positive rent payments. You'll build up your credit, and this is a win-win for everybody. And it sort of gives me, as a landlord, the peace of mind that, okay, well, now they know that if they miss a rent payment, this is going to show up negatively for sure in the credit report.
And car payments
really,
and credit cards, those are elective. Most everybody has debt payment in some form for housing. So for people not to have the opportunity to build their credit based on what is really a necessity, and therefore pretty much everybody, something that pretty much everybody does, it seems like a glaring hole that it seems past time to remedy that.
And I think a lot of them, in a lot of sense, just don't understand that, a missed rent payment could negatively affect their credit score.
Well, it hasn't,
and
though.
So, no, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Without the ability for someone like us to report it. But so now, like, kind of, being upfront about it right off the bat, right? I think that, it's going to create incentive for them to get it paid on time. And I think that's a win-win for everybody.
When you bring up a good point, because a lot of this comes through communication. Most people, like you alluded to, they don't report rental data, right? And so they find us, whether they have a tenant that asks about billing their credit, or they have a tenant that has stopped paying rent or is chronically late. And so using a tool like this where we like to think of our notifications, late payment notices, rent reminders, notices that your data has been reported to the credit bureaus. Like, those are ways to drive positive and proactive communication with your tenant. No one wants to evict a tenant for not paying rent. Like, when we provide, it's like, we want to work with that individual. We want to get paid. We want to help keep them in the house, assuming they're a good tenant otherwise, right? So it's like, what we try and we see is that that delinquency and late payment starts to drop because there's a near-term impact as far as the financial health of that individual. States like New York, where it can take a really long time to evict someone for non-payment of rent, you really see these tools start to come out, right?
Yeah. And evictions, there are lots of problems with evictions from the standpoint of all parties, right? I mean, it's really not a win for anybody. The housing provider never comes out ahead. Their expenses, they very rarely recoup what you were owed, or at least the expenses that you incurred in trying to collect it. And often, as part of the settlement, it's agreed that it doesn't go on their record. Right. My understanding is that, you can go through an entire eviction process and basically right up to the end, and to not end up having it show up on the screening reports anyway. So this is a way that the actual payment history can show up and be an indicator, like payment of any other kind, about kind of the reliability of a potential tenant.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's been a huge push in the past several years to obfuscate things like evictions, or even some criminal records, or those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Whereas this is payment data to a creditor, which is well established to exist on credit files. And so, when you're looking at it, someone's history of paying their housing is a pretty good indication of their likelihood to continue to pay for housing moving forward.
Yeah. So sorry, Chris, I maybe cut you off there, but in a best case scenario, like what I think you alluded to it before, somebody like me comes to you, he gets signed up before I bring a tenant into a unit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because you do provide the screening services.
We do.
And so as I'm screening, I'm advertising, and then I have applicants, I can run them through your screening service, and which will provide, do you do all three credit bureaus and that type of thing? How does your screening service work?
Yeah, we have screening. Mostly it's done through TU is our main one, and then the background checks. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other thing that we offer for free is our clauses. So I talked initially about having a conversation with any prospective tenants around you reporting. So, that's something that you can get on FrontLobby.com, pull those down, add those, even if you're not using us for screening, which you can, but, it's a matter of having that conversation with the proactive individual. The other thing to do is, a lot of the listeners here are going to have people in their properties, right? So if you're in a situation where you have someone that's stopped paying your rent, chronically late, or you just really want to implement these services, you can roll that out to your current portfolio. And so you can sign those tenants up. You can start using the tool as far as any sort of late payments. You can start reporting that information to the credit bureaus, giving them the opportunity to build their credit. So it doesn't just have to be right at the start. Okay. It can be at any point in time during that. So going back to kind of the topic of what our conversation was today, if you have someone you're thinking about evicting, maybe this Grant character is chronically late and now I'm 2 months late, and you say, okay, I'm going to start to pursue this. Like, starting to report on them while they're in their property through us is a really good first step, because it doesn't eliminate your ability to pursue them with small claims, with the local tenancy branch, go through any sort of eviction things. It often happens in parallel. And with that data being on the credit file, it's a low cost, high impact thing that you can do to make sure that when they're looking for housing, they're more likely to pay you when they have to pay to get that debt off, to find another property, or to get an auto loan, or other things.
Okay. Yeah. Explain that last part. So if they leave my unit owing me 2 months rent, then they will be required to, or will just want to, for the purposes of how they appear on paper, or on the credit reports, to pay me back that unpaid rent. Is that how that works?
would never be required. I mean, that would be awesome, but it's going to be that the future landlord or for an auto loan, they will see that debt on their credit file, right? So it'd just be like when you're screening a tenant, you say, oh, I see you owe JP Morgan $5,000 in a debt for a line of credit, or your auto loan or credit card, T-Mobile, whatever that is.
Right.
So it's to provide any sort of future creditor, housing or otherwise, with the accurate information of the risk profile of that individual. And for you as the person that's been extending housing to that person, make sure that you're top in line to get paid, because now there's real world impacts beyond just waiting for a small claims judgment or something like that, which is harder to enforce.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with this, the kind of the debt recovery piece of the puzzle, how does it work with FrontLobby? Like, so if I've, like in Eli's in his scenario, that if a tenant moves out and has got 2 months unpaid rent, it shows up on their credit report. Is there anything beyond that? Is there any service that FrontLobby offers that will actively kind of pursue that debt? Or is it sort of, that's just now out there, and just by being out there, and if they ever want to get financing for anything again, they're going to want to pay that off?
Yeah. I mean, we are not a collections agency.
Okay.
So we don't collect on your behalf. We don't negotiate. We, as a platform, allow you to send notices to the individual. So once a month, a notice will go and say, hey, as your landlord, it'll have your name and email, or company's name, contact email, to the individual that says, hey, our record shows you owe $2,000. That information got reported to the credit bureaus. They're likely also getting notifications from their bank, Credit Karma, or other ways where they're monitoring their credit. So they're usually getting notifications in several ways, even if you don't have an accurate email address for them. So, when you think about this situation, I alluded to consent earlier. That consent is not required when reporting a debt. So using the example, if someone has 2 months unpaid rent, let's just call it $4,000. They had moved out, could have been last month, could have been 5 years ago that this individual moved out. You'd sign up with FrontLobby, you'd enter that total outstanding debt that can be unpaid rent and utilities that are outlined in the lease. As long as you're reporting unpaid rent and utilities, you also don't need a judgment or a monetary order. Now, if someone broke your door and wrecked your barbecue and ripped off some drywall and there's X amount of damages, you would have to obtain a judgment or a monetary order to determine the dollar value of that. And then you can simply update the value that you're getting reported in order to have that accurately reflected. But unpaid rent to utilities that are in the lease, you can report no judgment, no consent, and that would show right away on their credit file. Usually what happens at that point in time is, if the person's in the property, you're usually going through an evictions process as well. If they've moved out, you may be pursuing it with the local tenancy branch or just other means that you're trying to do to collect them. Maybe that's phone calls or emails, or you're trying to go through wage garnishment or something like that. You can do that. If you ever get to the spot where you feel like you want to use a collections agency, that's not a problem. You would just stop reporting through FrontLobby if your collections agency reports the information, and you essentially kick the file over to them. So you have a bunch of that information, and that's really just to prevent you from double reporting on an individual. So we don't claim to be a collections agency. We offer a different service. It's kind of a low-cost way that you as a housing provider can report that data while you pursue other methods. And it's quite effective, as you can imagine, as far as helping people recover the debts.
Well, you're setting up a situation where they want to pay you because there is a consequence for not paying, which is a big difference between having to try to create an outside consequence, or to pursue.
Right.
You're setting up a situation where they want to have a clean slate.
Right. Exactly right.
I mean, it definitely speaks to, and it feels like it shouldn't need to be said, but it definitely speaks to renting to people who have, an incentive to follow through. So, and we've talked tons about this, and it's off topic for today, but, I'll just insert that when you are selecting tenants, you need to be careful about doing it and screen them methodically. This definitely argues for having people who have a decent credit score, and it doesn't have to be stellar, but a decent credit score to begin with, because then they have something to protect.
Yeah.
Or build, really.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, the other thing with reporting is that you can do it for co-signers or guarantors, and you can do it for every signatory on the lease. So every tenant, right? So even if the three of us are renting and I just happen to not pay my rent, that debt goes on everybody because everyone's legally responsible for it, right? So when you're looking to report and you think about the leverage of all of it, adding co-signers or guarantors, other individuals, it kind of helps create that ecosystem of accountability, which is really what we're trying to accomplish.
Exactly. And then, I guess when you've reported, a tenant's debt on there and then they do pay that, is that then something that the landlord manually goes into the system and says, all right, it's been collected, it's wiped clear, everything's good now? Or is there some other kind of means that somehow it knows that this debt's been paid off?
Yeah, I mean, for former tenants, it's super easy. You just enter the total outstanding debt when you sign up. And then as that balance changes, you just go in and manually update it, right? So it's a simple one. When you're looking for current tenants, we always assume that your current tenants stay in the units and pay on time every single month. So you're only updating if there's a debt. So if they don't pay rent on the 3rd, like you go in and you say, okay, there's $1,500 of unpaid rent this month. And if they pay things off throughout the month, you just have to make sure that it's accurate by the end of them, because there's a delay in the way that rental data gets reported. The previous month's rent is always getting reported in the middle of the month. So, you kind of have that full 30 days to update it throughout the calendar month before it gets processed to report.
Got it. So that's an interesting point that you just brought up in terms of how kind of the process works, that even though the positive rent payments are getting reported, the landlord is not necessarily reporting those positive rent payments. It just sort of happens automatically. Like you said, you're assuming that if I do nothing, that means I got paid, everything's good, and it shows up as a green check mark on the tenant's credit.
That's right.
Okay.
We assume landlords are busy and property managers are busy, and we assume that most people pay their rent, which both are true, right? And so it's, when you're looking at reporting a debt, there's an obligation to that, right? It has a negative impact on someone's financial well-being. And so we want to make sure that, one, that data is accurate, and two, that it's kind of being reflected appropriately on the individuals. This comes up quite a bit. Tenants have the ability to dispute the debt, which I often get asked about, which is a standard protection that exists for any sort of data that's on the consumer credit file. But that shouldn't scare you when you're looking to report. As long as you're reporting accurate information, you're only reporting the debts that are outlined clearly in the lease. You're not saying that this store is automatically worth $5,000 and, therefore it's a damage and I just don't like Chris, and so I'm going to throw this on the credit file. Like, that is absolutely not allowed, and there's a lot of protections around that. But if you're reporting accurate information, there's long established laws around the legality of doing it without consent. And we've been operating for several years, and there's other companies that do some debts as well. So, that shouldn't scare you. It's just it's kind of getting the information out there that this is an option for you. And when appropriate, it's a good thing to do for you. And when I say appropriate, meaning some people want to wait until the person moves out, or if you're already using a collections agency, not appropriate, or those sorts of things. So yeah, that's kind of how we end up playing.
And practically speaking, as the landlord, I have an account with FrontLobby, and I set up a tenant and kind of the basic terms of their lease is my understanding, correct? And then when there's a negative event, then I'm adding that information. It's otherwise assumed that rent's being paid and that things are going well. Is that correct? And then does the tenant have an account on FrontLobby, and do they interact with you guys, or is that completely separate?
Yeah. Breaking that into two parts. So when you're signing up, you need to verify yourself as a housing provider. That's the first protection, because the credit bureaus don't accept anonymized data. So we'll ask you to verify your ID, proof that you are a landlord or a property manager. It's super simple, right? But you just need to provide the appropriate documents, usually a copy of a property management agreement, or, a title, or one of your leases, something like that, just so that way, it's verified that you're a human reporting accurate data. When you're reporting on an individual, you just need basic lease information. So the property address, what the rent amount is each month, and then tenant details like their full name, date of birth, social if you have it. It's not required. I know it's becoming harder to capture that within the US, but just know that's an optional field. Email address if you have it, again, because we offer communication tools. And then each month, you'll just update the balance, right? So it's very simple as far as when you're creating an account, creating the information for the individual. Through the notifications that go out, the tenant can sign up for a free account with FrontLobby. And one, they can pay for the on-time reporting if that's something they want to do. So if you just have someone that says, hey, I want to have my on-time payments, they can pay for that and drive it. Or they can just view the information that's getting reported, right? So when you think about the accountability and transparency that we're trying to create within the housing space, if you're reporting data to the credit bureaus, we want the tenants to be able to see that information, just again, to verify the accuracy, communicate with you if they say there's a debt, right? It's like, okay, Eli, I'm right. I do know I owe you $500. That's coming on the 8th. I'm going to reach out, right? And so it does help with some of the proactive conversation and the transparency.
Does FrontLobby tie into, like, if I'm using a rent collection software of any sort, so that when my rent collection software knows that there's an unpaid rent, does that tie directly with you guys, or is it more
We do have
manual?
some integrations, whether
Okay.
that's with payment systems or property management solutions. Other ones we can pull it in. We can do export loads so that, if you are operating a larger portfolio, the best is just to reach out to us and we can come up with a solution to make it easy for you. If you're operating several hundred units, like, we want to make sure that it's pretty simple. Whereas if you have one or two, I guess basically meant that you can kind of run it on autopilot and it's minimal interaction from you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And what are the costs to the housing provider, and if any, to the tenant? You just mentioned paying for the positive reporting. I think that's a cost that goes to the tenant, correct?
Yeah, it can be either. So from a housing provider standpoint, to report current tenants, it's $239 per year. That allows you to report up to 20 current leases and all the tenants on those leases every single month. So that can be on-time payments, debts. You get access to notification tools, discount on our screening products, as well as discounts on former tenant debt reporting. If you're in the situation where a former tenant's moved out, from the past 7 years, you can report the data in the US. So anyone from the past 7 years, you can report that for a one-time fee. It's $199 for basic members, so meaning anyone that just signs up to do it, or it's $99 if you are a premium member. And again, that's just a one-time fee, allows that debt to be reported until it's marked as paid, or it goes through that 7-year statutes of limitations, which the credit bureaus have decided that after 7 years, rental debt can't exist on the credit file anymore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what else should we know about this space? Anything we haven't covered about the scenario where somebody is not paying or hasn't paid and is left, and what a landlord should do in that case?
Yeah. I think some words of advice are use it often and use it early, right? So the best time to start reporting is when the tenant moved in before they get delinquent, but saying the best time is start reporting today. The other mistake that people make is that they assume by reporting it's going to immediately get paid. And that's not the case, right? Often there's a delay in when the data shows up on the credit file. The tenant may not always check their credit. They may see that debt and say, oh, whatever, I can dispute this, or like that can take a while. So in parallel, make sure you're doing all the other best practices. I've heard both of you talk about it before in previous podcasts. You talk about it on your website, but kind of create this ecosystem around you of tools and resources to help protect you. Common ones being, make sure you're going through those appropriate steps to evict the tenant. Give the right notices at the right time. If you need a lawyer or paralegal, talk to them as you're reporting the data. If you need to take them to small claims court, do that while you're reporting the data. So our products are best used in parallel with some of these other ones if they're required. So you can start using us and then decide you need to pursue it in other ways, maybe with small claims or LTB or the tenancy branches. But simply relying on just a single solution, whether that's us or some things you're other doing, often pushes things down a few months. And as everyone on this call knows, the longer debt goes not being paid, the harder it is to recover it.
Right. That's fantastic advice. It's great. Love it.
Yeah.
So if any of our audience is looking for more information from you, where can they find that?
Best place to go is FrontLobby.com. We'll have all the information for you as far as, whether you're a current tenant, have a current tenants, former tenants. If you're in California and you need to deal with the new rent reporting legislation, we've got specific resources for you. You can always book a call with us or chat with us, email, whatever that is. So, if you're in a situation where you want to start reporting or you have a debt, that's the best place to go, and we'll make sure to get back to you and happy to jump on a call.
All right. Great. We'll put those links down in the description as well, so you guys can find FrontLobby.com.
Yeah.
Great.
That's great. Grant, thanks for the information. It's helpful to me, and I think pretty much anybody out here is in our same situation. So,
yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Appreciate you having me.
Thanks, Grant. Yeah.
all right, should we wrap up there and remind everybody to like and subscribe, come back to see us again. And if you subscribe, you'll get notified when our next episode comes out. And this has been Landlord Gurus. Appreciate you watching or listening.
Thanks, everyone.